I gave Linda a lengthy introduction last week. I'm not going to do that again, but I do want to say thank you again. Linda is one of the reasons I jumped headfirst into HASP, and I'm grateful that you're teaching this class as well. Thank you.
So, good morning. This is a huge subject. How many of you agree with me on that? And it has been handled and sometimes mishandled by many people with many motives behind what they're writing. And as we started out last week, at times the Dutch have taken a hit. And now that we've read, I mean, in terms of you guys brought slaves over here and created this whole problem that then America had to deal with for generations and generations leading up to the Civil War and to the racial issues that we have today. Today, we're going to go over what you read and share your insights and questions and your thoughts, because I think these readings, although they had to be selected from this book, hang together and introduce some surprising things that you probably hadn't been aware of about the history of the Reformed Church in Dutch Reformed Church in the early days. I want to cover a couple of things about terms. We are using the term slave in this class, and we're using the term Black. We don't have any reason not to use the word Negro, because today Black scholars and Black people are perfectly fine with that term. In materials produced for school children today, there's emerging a standard that you have to say enslaved persons. There is a reason for that we all understand, but it does get cumbersome to say enslaved persons every time that you're using these words. So for this class, because we're all adults and we understand how we're using these terms, that's what we're going to say. I also want to point out that as the people who are Christians in the Reformed tradition work with slavery in this colony, they are referring to both Indians and slaves as pagans and savages. And we're getting slammed for that by people who feel that anyone who tries to bring a new religion to a native culture is sinning against that culture and is destroying what they started with. Well, and there's a Dutch term, Wilden, W-I-L-D-E-N, the wild ones, which in a description of New Netherland, Adrian van der Donk explains that the term Wilden was originally just used by the women. It's what they called the Indians they were seeing because there wasn't any other name. If we say that something is in the wild, that's not negative. It just means natural. And it can mean uncivilized, but uncivilized in our terms means no written language, maybe no verb tenses in their language. So if your language will not support the sentence, if I had known you were coming, I would have baked a cake. There's no way they can say that. Some languages don't even have a future tense or a past perfect. By 1780, they had done this. If you don't have those tenses, then that's part of what the people who speak English mean when they say they're uncivilized. They don't have a language that rises to the level of the thought that's trying to be conveyed. And so their religion has to be, you could call it a natural religion. But I think that when many of the Dutch people used the word pagan, they simply meant something that was non-judgmental. How many of you are willing to say that's probably true? And I can see that some people were using it in a more non-judgmental, observational way, as Adrian van der Donk exemplifies. We'll see lots of people treat people like dirt and calling them pagans and savages. But even the word savage, which may be like, there's a similar word in French, may simply at times mean an unlettered person who hasn't had the experience of language development, and therefore thought development. It's not a claim that they're not intelligent enough to acquire all these things. So that's one clarification. I want to touch back on the books that I've stressed that are going to help you go off in your own direction. Description of New Netherland, and I can pass this around so you can just see what kind of a book it is and the chapters that it has. If you are interested in Sojourner Truth, and a couple people told me they were surprised and intrigued with what we said briefly about Sojourner Truth last week. The best book I know about Sojourner Truth is by Nell Irvin Painter. She's a professor at Princeton University, and she has an amazing view and very detailed, scholarly, and sympathetic view of Sojourner Truth. She is Black, and this book was written in the 1990s. And she makes clear that Sojourner Truth's image has been muddled, maligned, and manipulated crucially and sadly, actually by two people, one of which is Harriet Beecher Stowe, unfortunately. Harriet Beecher Stowe undertook to write Sojourner's story, but she put Sojourner into Southern dialect, you know, like Mark Twain used and like we all hate, and it's just a stereotype. And since she was a Northern slave, she never spoke that way. She spoke like the people that she lived with when she was up to 12 years old, who were white people speaking English with a Dutch accent. And that's the way she always spoke. And so Harriet Beecher Stowe gives her phrases like honey and so forth. And Sojourner Truth said, I never use the word honey. You know, just kind of. So if you're interested in Sojourner Truth, pay attention to Nell Irvin Painter, because she will lead you in the way to understand. And when you read this, if you went through this book and looked for her references to the Dutch Reformed Church, you would find out that, as I said last week, the relationship between Sojourner Truth and what the Reformed Church actually was is amazing, and it's been covered up. Harriet Beecher Stowe turned her into a Methodist. Was the easiest thing. She could just say, oh, well, she associated with some Methodists when she went to New York City, but that doesn't change where she came from or where she learned so much about the Bible. And the other writer turned her into a Quaker. So these abolitionists are writing about Sojourner Truth, and they turn her into the most handy handles of that time that people were associating with freedom. And the Dutch Reformed Church gets lost. But the Dutch Reformed Church is there. And I'm going to point out 2 points in Sojourner's life when somebody from the Reformed Church really made a difference for Sojourner Truth. One was a time when, as freedom was coming to that part of New York, it was illegal to sell children or sell any slave out of state. Nevertheless, Sojourner Truth's owners sold her son to a doctor who bought the boy and promptly took him out of state and went south. And she was heartbroken. Some people from, I think, that Klein Esopus Dutch Reformed Church that she had a lifelong connection with, some of whom had connections, like the Hardenbergs had connections. A lawyer named Romeyn, R-O-M-E-Y-N, took up her cause and took it to a judge, sent a no-nonsense reverse slave catcher down south that's going to go and kidnap the kid and bring him back, and then take that doctor by the ears and give him a good thrashing under the law. And Romeyn did that. This was the first case that a Black woman ever won against a white man. It should be featured more. And although the Dutch Reformed Church may have had a checkered record, as we say, here at that point when she's in trouble, somebody steps in and says, I know how to fix this. And in 3 days, the boy was back. Now, he was seriously damaged by what had happened to him. So if you read this, you'll see that wasn't just a quick fix and they all lived happily ever after. But at that turn, Somebody stepped in. Sojourner Truth is one of ours. We're going to go get her out of trouble. Another very interesting incident from the 1700s, where there's more to be explored about what happened to the Dutch slaves. In 1741, there was a very serious fire in New York City. I mean, really serious. There were fires from time to time. There'd been one about 20 years earlier that destroyed a lot around Wall Street and lower. But this was about 10 different fires starting in different places. So when that happens, they suspected the slaves had started a rebellion and were intent upon burning the city. And what they were going to do when the city was all burned, who knows? So if you read a book called New York Burning by Lepore, L-E-P-O-R-E is the name of the author. And it's a sidetrack for us today, but it's a fascinating book where she even recovered all the names of slaves, who they belonged to, the names of their masters, and so therefore where they were from. And when I started looking at that and looking at some of the numbers, and then how many slaves were hanged, how many slaves were burned at the stake, how many slaves were transported out of the country, and how many slaves were released and let go. Interesting fact. It looks to me like more Dutch slaves tend to wind up transported. Like, you're out of here, we're sending you back to another colony or whatever. Now, if I'm going to transport my slave, but I don't want to really transport my slave, I could arrange that, right? Especially if I had a few friends. I could make it look like that slave disappeared from all records and was listed on a transport list. But if those Dutch owners think that my slave was like a good slave, I don't want to cause this slave to be actually just hung out to dry. So I'm going to disguise the fact that he's on the transport list. So if they couldn't get them off, and this is just a guess, I didn't have time to go into this in detail, but some intelligent person who goes back to that book and looks harder at what were the fates of the different slaves, and is it true that somehow the slaves owned by Dutch people, especially if they were from up in the Hudson Valley and they were just down in New York for who knows what reason, were they protected by their owners? That doesn't mean their owners were more saintly figures than somebody else. It could just mean they were protecting their own interests. But it does add coloration to the treatment of that disastrous fire. And of course, the fire has completely disappeared from any history that the children would read. The idea that there might have been. And of course, the whole evidence for the alleged rebellion was shaky, but there's very detailed coverage of what was presented in court, who seems to be lying, what didn't fit with what. So you have a sort of mystery that you can follow. And it is an interesting book. So those two books, if you want to go into Sojourner Truth, or you want to go into a little bit about a slave. When we look at some numbers pretty soon, we're going to see that there was a drop in the importation of slaves after 1740. So whether it actually was plotted by slaves or not, the important thing is that it scared the pants off of the people who owned slaves, because it was a possible thing. And they said, what are we doing with this institution that could really just unravel our whole city? And we're finished with slavery. A few more people decide we're done with slavery, and the importation of slaves goes way down. And then, of course, after 1660, that is the end of the Dutch colony here. So those are the little sidelights. I also highly recommend American Slavery, Peter Colchin. And maybe I passed this around last week, but I'd like you to just take a look, get an idea what that is. Later on, we're going to talk about the different excuses that we can make for slavery. As a church, or the churches, the Protestant churches as a whole in the North were under siege. They were dealing with the right and wrong of slavery throughout the 1800s. The attacks on the Protestant churches were serious and constant. And Frederick Douglass, now this is leaping ahead, but we're talking about As slavery increases, people start to feel defensive about it as people say, what are we doing, or this is wrong. If even a few people start saying this is wrong, then you trigger the defenses. I'd like to raise your hand if you could think of one defense against slavery. For example, school of slavery. Slavery is good for them because they learn skills and trades and they have to get ready to be a grown-up. How many of you have heard that, including right now coming from the South, as they try to have greater control over the way slavery is presented in children's school books? So school of slavery is one. What's another one? Oh, listen, we're turning them into Christians. There's a quote in here from the classis of Brazil of the Reformed Church saying the principal reason for having slaves is to turn them into Christians and not for profit. They go harder and harder and more ridiculous in the things that they're willing to say. Yes, at least they could become Christians. What's another one? Don't look at me, look over there. We gave them a good life, okay? Look what they would have been. They were already prisoners of war in Africa by some king who had captured them. What miserable life did they face at that point? And by bringing them across the ocean to work for a few years, and maybe we might set them free, you know, if we treat them as indentures. They're much better off. We gave them a good life, okay? That's a good one.
Weren't there accounts, though, about slave children who were not educated? Because I think Frederick Douglass talks about this. He was educated by his owner's wife, Mrs. Thomas Alt.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I don't think her husband was very happy about this.
He definitely was not.
But was there not also that thought as well? Do not
Yes,
educate.
because Douglas brings it out clearly that
Yeah.
after Sophia Auld, who goes to her Bible classes at church and she reads the Bible at home, and the first thing he ever heard was the story of Job as he's sitting under a table and she's reading it. Hi, a story of Job starts with what? A rich man loses everything, right? Well, that must have been interesting for a little slave boy. And he stepped out from under the table and said, can you teach me to read? And so she starts teaching him the ABCs and the elements of learning. And today, in these Southern books that are coming out about the history of slavery, they say, his wonderful mistress taught him to read. False, because Douglas's point is that before he even could put words together very well, the husband came along and said, are you stupid? You can't do this. This is very dangerous. A slave who can read is a danger. They'll be getting ideas, he said. You teach a slave to read and it's their ticket to liberty. Douglas says himself about why he waited until he was 19 to run away. I wanted to learn to read and write so I could write my own pass, as a metaphor, and then literally too, he wrote a pass for himself in some of his attempts. So that's very true that some slave owners, now the ministers often tended to educate their slaves because they needed a literate slave, but there were literate slaves, but there was also powerful motivation to not educate the children. How about we have nice slavery here? We have Christian slavery. Okay, that's coming forth very, very much too. People who lived in the upper South, like Virginia and that middle strip of colonies, they'd say the really horrible slavery is down there in Mississippi and Alabama. And that's where they're really, letting people die on huge plantations and paying no attention, but we love our slaves. So we're going to be talking about a book that's brand new. This is here now in our culture. This is published by Scholastic and I think the 1990s, won many awards. And this is Nice Slavery. And they are going to try to tell you that in Virginia, the plantations were smaller. So therefore, on Christmas Day, the field hands could all come into the master's library. They came into his study, and I'm laughing. I'm thinking, oh yeah, all the field hands came into his study. Well, then they add some details and say, well, the study was the size of 3 cabins, And elsewhere they say the cabins were 12 by 12. Okay, so now we have the size of 3 little rooms, 12 by 12 for the masters. I'm still not buying it. But on Christmas Day in his study, the master gives them all their clothes for the coming year. Oh, that's nice. It probably only took about 20 minutes to hand out all the clothes for the next year. And then they could go on with the celebration of Christmas. And look at the lovely little clothes that the slaves are wearing as they hang up their stockings. Isn't that sweet? This is a new book. It's very popular. The sources and the authors are Patricia and Frederick McKissick, very successful Black couple who write children's books. And they've also written a biography of Douglas, in which the famous fight between Douglas and his master, Mr. Covey. In their book, Mr. Covey wins. In Douglas's book, Mr. Covey doesn't win. And so I'm going to let you look through this and see in how many ways this is not credible. But they're drawing on information from all the restored plantations in Virginia. Isn't that nice? And in the bookstores of restored plantations, you can buy this book. So I'll pass it around and you can see the art and the way that slavery is treated. So we're still doing, we have nice slavery here in Virginia. And they got by with it after probably much editing on that book to make sure they found that little narrow way where they could publish this book and get by with it as nonfiction. But the authors start their explanation by saying, not everything in this book happened at the same plantation, on the same plantation at the same time. Oh, really? In other words, it didn't happen. You picked little things from different plantations and you wove them together, and then you made up some other stuff, and you ignored the data that we have about the size of the plantations in Virginia, in fact. And you have a little book that you can bring out as nonfiction. Now, as an author for children, you can write whatever you want. You can make up whatever you want. You can write the Bobbsey twins in the Land of Cotton, which I did, the one and only Bobbsey twin book that goes south, by the way. And then you can make up all kinds of nice stuff as the Bobbsey twins go to the Land of Cotton. And you can say, we have nice slavery down here. So as we see these emerge, and possibly I was guilty of saying we might have nice slavery when I told you about the tavern, the building that we owned in New Jersey that had a nice cellar. And I was making the point that living in a cellar is not necessarily an ugly thing, because we had a beautiful cellar, which if you are trying to dwell in the realm of the possible and make the lives of your slaves better, might be the best place for them to learn how to operate in a tavern. And Olive Gilbert, who writes about this, they said it's just terrible to bring children anywhere near any glass of liquor. But the bigger picture is they are associating with people and learning some skills they will need when, as their owner knows, they will be freed during their lifetime by state law. So as you go through this, let's now hear some other insights, questions, and what surprised you as you read this material that you read this week. Were you surprised that the ministers owned slaves? Not at all. Okay. You were already primed last week for that fact.
I was surprised about how some of them weren't paid well.
You didn't know
Or at all.
Or at all. We're begging to have their salaries paid. Yeah. We have books, we see books that say that the Dutch East India Company paid the salaries of the ministers and supported the Dutch Reformed Church, implying it was a state church. It just had one more level of passing that money down. Well, some of the things you read proved that was not true. And we found out how Domi, whoever he was, raised the money for the church in the fort. He got his friends drunk at a wedding, had them sign for their pledges, and now they were stuck. If they regretted it the next morning, too bad. They still owed that money. And the church got built that way, not on the backs of the people, not somebody over in the Netherlands. Neither the church nor the state nor the Dutch West India Company built that church. And that's going to be true of other churches as well.
Yeah, I simply wanted to follow up to your comment. There would be a number of ministers who would claim that ministers are still not paid very well. So,
Right. That's true. And up in Albany, after Michaelius serves his 3 years, and Van Rensselaer brings him up to Rensselaer and White because he thinks he'd be a good minister for there. He left that pastorate because Van Rensselaer wouldn't pay what he had promised to pay. He's, a rich tycoon. He's a diamond and pearl merchant in Amsterdam. He can afford to pay the minister, but he doesn't want to. So the failure of anybody to support this orphan church brings it back to the people and very much to the elders in these churches that are sometimes forming with no minister in sight. It'll be years before they can find a minister at all. And looking more closely at Michaelius or Megapolensis, are we looking at the cream of the crop? I mean, we're talking about ministerial skills that have the right motives and the proper skills, and they're smart. What do you think, Steve? I mean, we've got one minister here. We can pick on him for a little bit.
sure. Well, I think there's a tendency historically to romanticize both Michaelius and Megapolensis. I have to confess ignorance that I don't know a lot about
Okay.
Michaelius. And what I do know about Megapolensis was that he certainly was zealous about evangelizing the North American Indians
Yes.
in the Mohawk region, in the
Yes.
Mohawk Valley.
Yes.
So,
Okay, let's go to something that we see on page 24 in your handout. Under Michaelius, a modest minister for modest beginnings. This is from a letter that Michaelius wrote in August of 1628 to a Dominie minister back in Amsterdam, so a minister friend of his. At the first administration of the Lord's Supper, which was observed, not without great joy and comfort to many, we had fully 50 communicants, Walloons and Dutch, a number of whom made their first confession of faith before us, and others exhibited their church certificate of being in good standing. Others had forgotten to bring their certificates with them, not thinking that a church would be formed and established here, and some who brought them had lost them, but they were admitted upon satisfactory testimony of others to whom this was known, and also upon their daily good deportment, since one cannot observe strictly all the usual formalities in making a beginning under such circumstances. What is he doing? He's explaining to his bosses back in the Netherlands how he departed from his instructions and had to deal with the situation before him, and that this is the way he should be doing it. He's defending himself. He's not just secretly doing what he's doing. He's making his report, and look how well written that is. So it's interesting. Now, then he goes on. We administer the Holy Supper of the Lord once in 4 months, provisionally until a larger number of people shall necessitate a change, assuming this church is going to grow. The Walloons and French have no service on Sundays otherwise than in the Dutch language. For those who understand no Dutch are very few. Nevertheless, the Lord's Supper is administered to them in the French language and according to the French mode, a different book of church order, with a sermon preceding, which I have before me in writing, so long as I cannot trust myself extemporaneously. Now, I really got a lot out of that. Extemporaneously means without a script in front of me. It doesn't necessarily mean off the cuff, but not reading from a script. Now that means that usually when he's speaking in Dutch, he is speaking extemporaneously. In other words, not from some kind of highfalutin, densely thing, every line read off of a piece of paper, which is the image we get sometimes. We're getting the image of a preacher who's preaching extemporaneously, and that his French is not so good. So when he preaches in French, he has to write it out and read it aloud in French. Now that's not all that bad. That's really a man responding to the people that he has. And you didn't know that the language of the First Lord's Supper was not Latin, not English, not Old English. It was French. That, so that's interesting.
On page 24 also, it mentions that Michaelius, he enrolled at the University of Leiden at the age of 14, and he stayed there for 6 years. So he was highly educated. University of Leiden was definitely, it's like the Harvard of the Netherlands at
Right.
that time.
Absolutely.
So he had some really good credentials, and I'm sure he learned French at the University of Leiden, but he hadn't already known it.
And as you
Oh.
see, yes, go ahead. And as you see, I put my little note there, Arminius ? Because Arminius was also Arminius was a professor of theology at the University of Leiden until Gomers got mad at it. And until that time, he and Gomers had a working relationship. They could both express their views, no problem. Theology is not going to, fall apart because they have a disagreement.
I just wonder about your comment. Do you think that the ministers in the Netherlands thought that the mainstream people in the United States or North America were not as receptive to the religious field, so they didn't want to send their best ministers over there anyway, because those people would not understand it as well as the people in the Netherlands themselves. So,
Okay.
and that makes sense to me.
Making second-class citizens out of the settlers in the Netherlands. That's a possible line of thinking, but another line of thinking is that's implied in this thing is, I hate to harp on the Synod of Dort. Let's make it short about the Synod of Dort. The Synod of Dort had two parts. The first part was the part we've all heard about, the theological points they were trying to settle. Delegates from about 6 different nations, first international attempt to come to a theology that could work for all, worked through November, December, January, and February on this. 4 months of living in a hotel, bringing your clerk with you, and going to these big meetings every single day to hash out these theological things in Latin and in the other languages. You can imagine what they were doing, and they come up with the theology. Now they're done. All the international people go home. And there were no people there from France because the King of France wouldn't allow anybody to come to Dort. So just the Dutch delegates stay in Dort to write a book of church order only for the Dutch church, because the other churches all had different kings and different things they came from. So their church order was going to be different. Like, for example, having a sermon before the communion or after the communion, or what specifics you want in the liturgy or the structure of the church. So that's being referred to here. They have their own independent book of church order, even though the theology is very similar. So efforts, they're already a multinational church that they've dealt with back in the Netherlands. And the ministers all know that their book of church order applies only to them. Now, when we get to Van Raalte, you're going to unfortunately be meeting the order of Dort over and over again, because Van Raalte was devoted and married to Dort. He kept bringing up, but he wasn't, to me, he was referring to the church order part of that, because he was concerned that you get the power structure right in your church so that it won't fall apart in 5 years, because you have a way for people settle their differences and still be orderly. Decently and in good order is over and over again in our church order. And so Van Raalte knew that that would work and other things wouldn't. And Van Raalte had his failures over in the Netherlands of trying to start new churches and seeing it fail. So those failures had fed into his conviction that that church order was his ticket to a new lonely church out in pioneer land where people were trying to get together, who some of them were more separatist thinking and some of them were more generalist thinking, and they had to get together. Were you surprised that when the English took over, it was bloodless and no property changed hands, no churches changed hands, the church went on as before? In fact, when the English took over, they were getting public money for the first time because the Church of England allowed them to participate in that. They said, ha, they're so tiny and they're only speaking Dutch. We have nothing to risk by giving them a little bit of support. Let them keep up their churches and keep up their Dutch sermons and stuff. And the Church of England has nothing to lose by sending, 700 missionaries down here to start Church of England churches because they were so lazy about not getting it done. And then but we'll let them have their churches and their ways.
Not to mention the fact that the British outnumbered the Dutch.
Right.
Very, very large, big
Right.
big.
So look, yeah.
And so why risk losing your soldiers against just a handful of people of Dutch? Just absorb them. And
Right.
that's what they were hoping to do, I
Right.
think, by subsidizing them.
Right. It was basically fly our flag and everything else stays the same, except your governor is out of here. Stuyvesant is out of here, but the settlers were sick of Stuyvesant by that time. Stuyvesant had made his own mistakes and acted like a tyrant. They were ready for a change. And they thought, what could be so bad about an English governor being in charge down here? To some extent, have you ever heard the old Chinese proverb, the mountain is high and the emperor is far away? So it was sort of, we can deal with this. I don't think the new governor is going to be sending some magistrate to visit our classes meeting. Now, so the church is becoming a little bit more Americanized at the time that the English take over. They're going to be under an English system, and they're going to have their problems with the English eventually, because the revolution is only 110 miles away. But they wisely decided with Peter Stuyvesant, before we take up our guns and start shooting at Englishmen, let's wait about 110 years until we get ready for that point, and then we'll see where we are. Okay. Any other questions? Let's go through these slides. Now, when the British wrested New York from the Dutch in 1664, oh dear, I just want to get rid of this. The truth about its thriving polyglot, meaning many language, society began to disappear into myths about a cartoonish, peg-legged governor and an island purchased for $24. But the story of the Dutch colony of New Netherland was merely lost, not destroyed. And then he refers to what I did last week, this new cache of 12,000 pages of its records, recently declared a national treasure, are now being translated. Do I want to click that? Okay. Drawing on this remarkable archive, Russell Shorto has created a gripping narrative, and it really reads like a novel. You will like it a lot. A story of global sweep centered on a wilderness called Manhattan that transforms our understanding of early America. So although they don't have a very good record, as far as we can tell from what we've covered about the ministers owning slaves, and they're not raising an outcry against slavery in any obvious way that we know. Remember, they don't have any governance at all. They're subject to the classes of Amsterdam. They have no classes on this side. So who's going to speak for the ministers? They don't even have a classes. And at the time of handover, as we said, there are 13 churches, but there are only 4 ministers in the entire colony. And 2 of them leave within a year. So they have been orphaned. And then, but they transformed our understanding of early America because the citizens of New York had asserted themselves and created a council of 9 that told Peter Stuyvesant what to do. So for the first time, an elected group of representatives of the people had an opportunity to fight against and straighten out the governor without taking up arms against him, but by means that he knew he needed to cooperate with, because they had the purse strings. The governor needed money and he needed to make assessments on the people in order to build his roads and so forth. So he needed their consent, and his advisor said, you've got to have a council. So first he picks a council the old fashioned way, nominate 18 people and I'll pick 9 of them. So they did that. Now he's got 9. He thinks they're going to be a rubber stamp. But does that work out? No, very soon those rubber stamp people aren't rubber stamping anymore, and they have other ideas and other agendas. And so we begin to see the fight, and New Yorkers are very proud of telling you that in 1649, they already had a city council. And so this book is going to tell you the whole story of that, and it's going to highlight the hero of the book, who is Adrian van der Donck. And Adrian van der Donck, you're just going to love him. We always, when we're reading a history that's grim and everything's going wrong and stuff is going downhill, we see a leader emerge who can do something about it. So he's a combination of the Thomas Jefferson and the George Washington of the middle colonies. And if he had not been killed by Indians in about 1656, Adrian van der Donck was in line to be the president of that next council. And maybe it would have been different. Maybe they would have fought back, or, or they would have worked under the English, but van der Donck would have been a distinguished leader. And when you read how he writes, you're going to know this is our guy. This is the one we need. And he was a Renaissance man, and he would have been a member of a Reformed church. There's almost no doubt about it. There's nothing that he writes that would be against what a Reformed church person would believe. And he has that love of justice and that commitment to nonviolent action and the commitments that you would expect of that time. You should see the way he writes about the Indians with intelligence and close observation and treating them as an interesting human creature. Judy.
Given his sympathetic treatment of Indians, how is it that he was killed by Indians?
That is the
caused
irony.
that?
That's the irony that Shorto is going to point out, that it's just so sad. And actually, Shorto has a theory about that. So you'll like the way he treats that in this book. Well, that Peter Stuyvesant's bold attempt to go down and conquer New Sweden to prove the Dutch are in control down here, because Delaware was being settled by some Swedish people. He gets together a multitude and goes down and forces them to just raise the Dutch flag. No shots are fired. It's bloodless. The 400-pound governor of 380-pound or something governor of New Sweden capitulates immediately. So the flag is changed. Stuyvesant sails away back to Manhattan. For all we know, they raised the Swedish flag again. Who knows? The governor is far away. But New Sweden came under the Dutch. But what it did was disrupt the Indian trade that was based down there, Shorto says. All of a sudden, masses of Indians no longer could sell what they were selling, or the price had gone up, or trade had been damaged. And the Indians have had enough, and they start allying with each other in the collar around the Dutch colony, all through there. Many tribes, all the way up to the Mohawks. And all of a sudden, Indian raids start occurring in Manhattan. And that triggers the Indian War that I mentioned last week, where because their trade, they felt the Dutch had betrayed them. And that was Peter Stuyvesant's fault. He should have left well enough alone. But he wasn't smart enough to do that. He wanted another military victory because that was his idea. And that because of that, these raids started that not only cost the colony, dropping its population from 3,000 to 1,000, not only just with people killed, but people saying, I've had enough of this. I'm going back to the Netherlands. I can't do this. It's too dangerous. And sure enough, in that area around Yonkers and Mamaroneck and Westchester County, Vanderdonk's estate gets raided and he's killed. They don't know for sure, but it's the only thing that fits together with the information that we do have. These are pictures in Shorto of London and Amsterdam and London, the two cities that shaped New York, he says. Then here's his title page with a map on it. This is Russell Shorto, who lives in the Hudson Valley region. The other things he's published are Gospel Truth about the search for the historical Jesus, Saints and Madmen about psychiatry and religion. So he is interested in the history of religion, and he's very good in writing about it. The hub of his research is for the Island Senate is the New Netherland Project at the New York State Library, where the archives of the Dutch colony are centered on Manhattan, are being translated up around Albany. He lives in New York's Hudson Valley with his wife and two daughters. Now look at this paragraph. Here is 1640. We're up to 1640. Dying from within and attacked from without, the Manhattan colony, circa 1640, was thus firmly on the road to extinction. It wasn't even a proper political entity. It had no government. Its inhabitants were less citizens of a republic than serfs working at the behest of a multinational company. True, it sat on the verge of a vast continent that Europeans were soon to penetrate, motivated by the zeal to expand their horizons in the wake of men like Galileo, Harvey, Duke, Great Hudson, and also by the desire to flee decades of religion-fueled war at home. As the geographic key to unlocking the continent, this region would one day help shift the global center of power. One could argue that it would become the point on which Western civilization itself would pivot as it shifted from the Renaissance era to the modern world, from Eurocentrism to a global perspective. But for all that promise, it was little more than a place of chaos and slop, of barroom knife fights, soldiers fornicating with Indian women while on guard duty, and a steady stream of wayward newcomers, hard men hoisting themselves out of skiffs and hitting the packed soil of the Strand, purse strings around their necks heavy with careless guilders or Spanish pieces of eight, ready to smuggle, drink, trade, whore, and be gone. Henry Hudson had ensured that the settlement was under Dutch auspices, but so far, the vaunted characteristic of Dutch society as a pluralist, tolerant republic was in evidence only in a negative way. It might as well have been any nation's dregs clinging to the southern tip of the wilderness island called Manhattan. It was as if the world, having dimly identified this piece of land and water on the edge of the New World as a fulcrum, wasn't yet ready for it, and so let it disintegrate. It was a community, in other words, sure to die out, one that history could safely forget. That was New York in 1640. And now enter Adrian Vanderdonk to put everything back together as, it could be. Now we're going to look at some slave statistics here. And I know your eyes may be glazed over when statistics appear on the screen, but let's take a look at where slave populations between 1790 and 1860 stood. In other words, a little more than 100 years after the English takeover of Manhattan. So what state shows up with the highest number of what region? The South, of course. The Upper South has much higher numbers in 1790 than the Lower South, the Deep South. Upper South being Virginia and so forth. But by 1860, look at the growth. The Deep South in 1790 is at 136,358 slaves, or a roughly 20% of the population. But the Deep South by 1860 is 2,423,467 for 61.3% of the population. Look at that. That's what the English did, guys. So don't blame the Dutch. Because the English no sooner saw that the Dutch West India Company had apparently made some money off of slave trade, but they formed the Royal African Company, which got serious with the British Navy behind it about seizing the slave ports and really transporting some big numbers of slaves. Then look at the states in South Carolina. And the huge change in the percentage of the population, 1790 and 1860. So this is the time period when we crossed that Rubicon where slavery was going to be extremely difficult to deal with because it was not a minor thing at all. Distribution of slaves by size of holdings. Now, I like this because your little book that has "We Have Nice Slavery" over here is telling you that in Virginia, all the field hands fit into the master's study. So in the Upper South, percentage of slaves held in units of 1 to 9 in the Upper South, Virginia, would be 35%. The percentage of slaves held in units of 10 to 49 was 53%. The percentage of slaves held in a really big 50 to 199 slaves was 11%. And the over 199 slaves was 0.6%. And then in the Deep South, you can see those are shifting too, and Jamaica. What are the chances that the number of slaves was like 1 to 9 in Virginia in 1859, which is when that book is set? Well, I guess 35%, but way less than half. 35% of the slaves held in units of 1 to 9. And even 9 is how well can you know 9 slaves? And what's the situation when you have 9 slaves? Median holdings of slaves by state. New York is not on here because we didn't go back far enough. 1790, 1850, and 1860. So just look at this and make a couple comments. What do you see? Median holdings of slaves by state. Meaning equal numbers of slaves were held in units larger than this and smaller than the median figure. The median is not an average, it's just the figure that's in the middle. The equal number of plantations that were more than this and less than this. So the median size of a holding of slaves in Virginia in 1850 was 18. So half of the plantations had more than 18, and half of the plantations had fewer than 18. But that means that the large majority of slaves were located on a big plantation, right? Because all those numbers above that is the number of slaves is just one element here. See what I mean? When you're talking about the median, that upper number, most of the slaves in Virginia were on big plantations. But here's the book. Now let's look what they did. This is the family around the Christmas tree, and there's some black figures there. And the notes say, the large estate with hundreds of slaves, in the second paragraph, is a romanticized view of the before Civil War South, Catherine Jones wrote in the introduction to The Plantation South. Thank you, Catherine Jones. That's an incorrect statement. Quote, there was no agreement even as to what constituted a plantation, with President Madison insisting that his 3,000 acres at Montpelier was a farm, while many a smaller place went by the more prestigious designation of plantation, trying to muddy the term. Actually, the average slave owner kept one slave woman who served as a cook, housekeeper, and nursemaid, and one slave man who helped in the fields and did other household chores. Sometimes the slave man and woman were married. If they were, their children were sold at about age 8. Well, at least that's a rough statement. In Before Freedom, when I just can remember, a collection of slave narratives, Robert totally recalled, my master was rich, slaves in quarters 300 yards from the big house. A street run through the quarters, homes on each side. Beds was homemade, mattresses made of wheat straw. Bed covers was quilts and counterpanes, all made by slave women. So what you're going to see in that little romanticized book that we're passing around is what's described right there by one slave from one plantation, where he claims that that many slaves could all have window pane quilts and that the staff was limited to that. Most slave cabins were wooden structures about 12 by 12 or 12 by 16 with dirt floors and a crudely cut door. The windows had no panes. As many as 10 or 12 people lived in this space where life began and ended, but that doesn't fit with what they're showing. That doesn't fit with what they're showing in the book. Look at the contradictions here. The book is just an amalgam of 50 people who want to support the recovery of pretend plantations, where they have a nice little cabin that they illustrate that's supposed to be a slave cabin. And going on across the South, have any of you visited a restored plantation in the South? Number of people have. Interesting. Okay. And then they're going to proceed with notes. So here are some of the illustrations. Slaves going out on Christmas morning and people playing in the yard. Come Christmas morning, the slaves gather outside the big house and shout, "Christmas gift." Massa comes to the window and playfully shows disgust at being caught in the game of who can say the greeting first, and therefore claim a gift. Now, Frederick Douglass also explained Christmas on the plantation. Number one, the master's not there. He's at his grandiose house in Richmond or Charleston or Lexington, celebrating the holidays with all the parties that are going on there among the elite. He's not at his farm loving Christmas with his employees. Nevertheless, duty dictates that master and mistress of the big house come down to welcome their first visitors. Mrs. compliments everyone on the way they look, all dressed in their Sunday best. Massa invites all the men into his study. Wow. For the new field hands bought since last year, this is the first time they've ever been in the main part of the house. Massa's study is as big as 3 cabins. That's where we got the 12 by 12 cabins. One wall of windows lets the light stream in. Bookshelves line 2 facing walls, floor to ceiling. An imposing mahogany desk with claw and ball feet is set across from the marble fireplace. 2 large fireside chairs look comfortable, but no slave dares take a seat. A young house servant dutifully pokes up the fire, lays on another log, and takes his place with the others. Massa passes out clothing for the year, graciously given and humbly received. Are you going? How many people, I mean, in this room, we're going, oh, I'm gagging, please. With the wave of his hand, he announces that the smokehouse will be opened and any cut of meat my people want can be taken for the Christmas dinner in the quarters, hams included. Oh boy, the massa gave us a ham. The missus receives the women and children in the parlor. Here's the massa lending them his violin. And then we'll go to the end of the book. And this is how it ends. Now, they are going to end the book with the slaves wishing that they could be free. I mean, they can't get by with this book without showing in some way that in spite of all their wonderful lives here, they still want to be free. The families who celebrated Christmas 1859 in the big house and in the quarters had no way of knowing how much their lives would change in the 5 years. Abraham Lincoln would be elected president in November 1860, and 5 days before Christmas, South Carolina would secede from the Union. Edmund Ruffin, Sr. from Virginia, yay, would fire the first shot at Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. On New Year's Day, January 1, 1863, President Lincoln would sign the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all the slaves in the rebel states excluding 7 counties in eastern Virginia. Those who ate dinner in the big house and danced the cakewalk in the quarters didn't know in 1859 that a war would be fought in their fields and woods, or that some of the old plantation houses would be burned or used as military headquarters or hospitals. They didn't know that cholera would kill thousands of newly freed slaves. They didn't know that thousands of soldiers would die, and in the end, Robert E. Lee would surrender to U.S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The Civil War would end then, and so would the plantation South, to be remembered in songs and poems, especially at Christmas time, when we serve eggnog, put a red bow on our door, sing a carol, or tell a story around the hearth. This book is very popular and was extremely well reviewed by the sloppy, inattentive book reviewers of children's books.
I am struck by the last part of the last sentence of the first paragraph. I think that's it. Where is it? Yes, something about on New Year's Day, President Lincoln would sign the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all the slaves in the rebel states, excluding 7 counties in Eastern Virginia. Is that because it was Virginia that fired back on those first shots that were fired from Fort Sumter? I mean, was it like a reward for Virginia?
I'm not actually sure why they're saying this little area was excluded. Anybody have an idea? That would be a detail.
We were in a Civil War and Virginia was close to Washington, D.C. and it had been nearly captured many times. And so Lincoln didn't want to aggravate the border state upper Virginia area, because those areas, including Maryland and Kentucky and even parts of Tennessee, were central to the Union military effort. You may have heard the statement of Lincoln that I pray all the time to have Kentucky on my side, but by God, I must have Kentucky. It's that was indispensable, those areas, to defend the North and prosecute the Civil War. It was primarily a military issue. The whole Emancipation Proclamation was a military measure.
Yes, and therefore the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued 3 months before January 1st, it was like a warning to the South, do this or I'm going to sign this on January 1. So there were terms that they could follow if they wanted to. And Lincoln was hoping and praying that his idea about how the proclamation would work. He had said, all states that are still in rebellion on January 1 will have their slaves freed. In other words, but if you send representatives back to Congress or determine to do so by January 1, then you can keep your slaves. He was guaranteeing the South that if they would lay down their arms and send representatives back to Congress, there would be no freeing of slaves at all. They would go back to where it was before and try to work it out peacefully in a Congress. And if he thought that if a referendum were handled at that point in each state by the pretty much slave oligarchy that ran each state, if there were a vote of the people, they wouldn't want to continue the war, that they would come back into the Union. And he hoped and believed that the people of the South would have voted to come back to Washington in order to end the war, and then they got to keep their slaves if they did that. Not a single state was willing to offer a referendum. So whoever claims that the Confederacy was at the will of the people is lying, because they were not willing to put that to a test of an actual test at the ballot box, whether the people in the South in 1863, after they had had tremendous losses, never got a chance to vote on whether to accept Lincoln's terms. So he was hoping that, but that's why these exceptions. So Maryland kept its slaves, Kentucky kept its slaves, and this was not those slaves were not freed until Congress acted after the war to free the other slaves. Here's the mistress accepting the gifts of the slaves. They line up as their names are called. Well, if you have 150 slaves, can you even call their names even if you have to? Probably not. And come up and give a personal good. Thank you for the handkerchief, Mrs. Thank you for the earrings. Thank you for the pretty red scarf. The missus is given a collective gift of a dozen eggs, perhaps a handmade basket or hand-carved candle holder. Humbly given and graciously received, say the black authors of this book. It shows she is liked. There are special treats for the children. And here is the Thanksgiving-like picture of the slaves having their own Christmas dinner. Now, my theory is that there were some people that reviewed this book to try to have them back off on some of their aggressive misrepresentations of slavery. And that at the last stage, some critics said that clothing is way too grand for anything that you could find on a slave in these conditions. So they said, well, we can't withdraw, but we can put a patch on that coat. Just kind of put it over the top at the last minute. And I'll bet you, this is a guess, that this patch was added at the last minute to kind of emphasize that they're just wearing, there's another statement here that the slaves received the leftover clothes of the master and mistress. How many slaves received the leftover clothes? Master and mistress again. But this is certainly romanticized, and it's certainly our idea. They're trying to show you a Southern meal that the slaves could cook when they had their own Christmas. And then it's very clear that the slaves are all Christians because they sing carols and so forth. And then here we have some other figures on the free Black population between 1790 and 1860. And I emphasized last week that even by 1660, there were some literate slaves in the North, because some had never been slaves. They got indentured immediately and earned their way out. Some, like Olaudah Aquino, was allowed to buy his own freedom after going through several layers of slavery. Some owners freed their slaves when they died, and so they had a chance. So the free Blacks in absolute numbers and as a percentage of total Black population. So what do we notice here? Yeah, New York is not on here. Well, we noticed that the more northern, that Delaware had a 30% free Black population in 1790. And we noticed that Maryland, where Frederick Douglass grew up, in 1860 had a 49% free Black population. And we noticed in 1840, it was already 41% free in Maryland by 1840. When Frederick Douglass comes to Baltimore and there learns to read, he eventually joins what's called the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society, which was a group of Blacks who were trying to do mental improvement. He was the only one who was a slave, and he was the only one who could read. So these were illiterate, free Blacks trying to improve themselves. And this is where he met Anna Murray, his eventual wife, in the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society. So we have to realize that places like Baltimore had a tremendous population of people who somehow or another, they were not slaves, and some of them were doing okay. So I think, so that is from this book. Now, this is a typical cartoon, of course, that the abolitionists were creating to show you the horrors of slavery and remind you that it boiled down to auctions and babies being waved by the arm in the air while the mother pleads from the floor. And the slave owners would come along and say, "You dirty rats, you're doing an extreme picture of something that hardly ever happens in our nice place of Baltimore or Virginia or New York. We don't have auctions like that. So it's like, look over there. We have nice slavery. We're not doing, a lot of people are worse than we are. And look how it ends up." I'm going to skip over this because this is going to go into the American Revolution. Let's skip that for now. Okay, are there any questions? Now we have 20 minutes left before the end, and I want to briefly touch, oh, Steve.
I'm curious, who in the Reformed Church in America or the Dutch Reformed Church, because until the late 1800s did we become the Reformed Church in America, who was either speaking out against slavery among the clergy or laypersons of the RCA or the Dutch Reformed Church, Reformed Protestant Dutch Church more correctly? Conversely, who among our folks were advocating for the retention of slavery?
Okay, in the 1850s, a professor at New Brunswick Seminary wrote a book called Slavery Not Wrong. That's the name of the book, Slavery Not Wrong. And he's going through all his biblical, things. So he's like, just like the 7 verses that everybody uses when they try to say homosexuality is wrong. He got 7 verses behind them, and the 7 clobber verses. So this was that type of a book, Slavery Not Wrong. But as Brooking points out, one of his elders in the city of New Brunswick takes up a debate against this professor and presents all the arguments that were in the air at that time about how slavery was wrong, and was permitted to make that speech and had equal authority. We remember also that in the Book of Church Order, it says that elders have equal authority with the ministers. And then if you make them equally present on all the governing boards, those ministers are surrounded by elders who can talk back to them, and that one minister is not over another minister. They didn't want a hierarchy of ministers. They didn't want bishops. They didn't want the minister of a big church to be able to lord it over the minister of a smaller church or that type of thing. And they could not allow one classis to accuse another classis of anything. You can't have a classis to classis cash, and I'm going to tell on you and I'm going to take it to the top. That doesn't work. As long as your process was correct on whatever that was, it's not going to be overturned at the next level up. And that's been shown over and over again. So I think that the sturdy structure of the Reformed Church at least saved the possibility of people speaking up against slavery and not being dismissed or kicked out or whatever. However, the Reformed Church has a long history of kicking out their people who argue too vociferously, and the local congregations certainly can decide that somebody's got to go. And for example, A.J. Muste, one of the most famous pacifists who ever graduated from Hope College, was heavily opposed in the Reformed Church, and pacifism was not popular in the Reformed Church. You had a tremendous uphill climb to be a pacifist in the Reformed Church. And Muste paid the price. I have an uncle who was a conscientious objector in World War II. And he decided when he was a teenager in South Holland, Illinois, that he just couldn't go along with war. And he would talk to his minister, who was a friend of my grandfather's and happened to be the father of the former president of Western Seminary, who lived across from Third Church, Hesling. Hesling's wife, Etta Hesling's father, was the minister of that church. Terlouw, okay. Thank you. Reverend Terlouw was sympathetic to Uncle Carl. He listened to him, he talked to him, he clearly respected him. So Uncle Carl felt supported in his beliefs. But his own family had a hard time with that. His mother was sympathetic, my mother was sympathetic, but my grandfather was just horrified. And so there's a celebration of the men going to war from that church. And all the men who are signing up for the war receive Bibles, and there's a ceremony and they're celebrating. Uncle Carl is left out. No Bible for Uncle Carl. Now, he was going to serve his country. He went to a lumber camp in the Northwest as his assignment for the same 3 years anybody else was giving to their country. But he didn't get a Bible. And I think for the rest of his life, he couldn't forgive Reverend Terlouw for not standing up for him. And yet, Reverend Terlouw was that sympathetic voice that then, when the time came, he wasn't going to make a battle out of how the people felt about the men who were going to defend their country and the one who just couldn't do it. Uncle Carl wrote some memoirs, and they're in the Hope College archives, about what it was like to be in a conscientious objector camp during World War II. And those men stayed together their whole lives. They continued to have get-togethers and bonded with each other within the first, but don't think it was only in the church at home that he met serious resentment, because in the first 2 weeks he was in that lumber camp, both of his legs were broken. Some big machine backed up on him, and the soldier got armed. And Uncle Carl never said this. Uncle Carl never accused anyone of foul play, but I do in my mind. I think it's highly possible that somebody working for the government out there just didn't like all these cheaters who were getting out of the war, especially when they weren't even Quakers. You know, they weren't from a denomination that was uniformly pacifist. So it was hard. And in the Vietnam War, again, anyone in our era who was a minister who opposed the Vietnam War was in trouble. Your congregation wasn't going to put up with it. So my idealistic husband, John de Velder, at New Brunswick Seminary, rallies his seminary buddies, 8 or 10 men in that class, and they all decide to turn in their draft cards to the classes of New Brunswick, like sanctuary, turn in our draft cards. Yes, we have an exemption. We're never going to that Vietnam War. We're in seminary. And when we're ministers, we'll still have an exemption, but John feels morally obligated to stand up for what you believe and not just take the easy way out. So he organizes, and boy, did the ministers in that classes feel like they were in the hot seat. De Velder, why did you have to do to us? Don't bring us your draft cards. We're going to let you think what you think, but don't come here and make it my problem. I got a congregation to satisfy. I mean, you can understand. Now, I don't think we understand how much trouble ministers are in if somebody gets in their bonnet to let them go because of something they believe. You know, we have separation of church and state in our country, right? So there's something in the laws called the ministerial exception. And this means that if a minister is being kicked out by a church for any reason, the law won't touch it. That church has an absolute right to fire who they want to fire for whatever reason. So if there's no check and balance within the church's structure, then that minister is out of luck. He cannot go to any court and claim wrongful termination or whatever. And ministers do not have unemployment insurance. You know, in a general job out in the world, if you get fired, you do get, I believe you get unemployment insurance, and you will have a cushion to ride on, paid for, you know, by taxes. Ministers don't have that. They're not in that system. It's not paid into by the church. So whatever their package is when they're let go, that's it. They don't get to add workman's compensation to help you over the hump as well. So a minister who gets fired has a lot to risk, even greater than what another laborer might have. So it takes courage for ministers to stand up. That doesn't mean that, Doug Brower was saying that at the seminary you went to, whose image was it on the wall that inspired you? Oh, it was A.J. Musty's image, wasn't it? Elijah Parrish Lovejoy, a minister whose press was thrown into the Mississippi River by a mob, and Lovejoy was killed, wasn't he?
He was shot, yes.
All right, so Lovejoy's image is honored at Princeton Seminary?
Yes,
So you testified that you and your,
we had to walk by this plaque every day on the way into the dining hall. So it was kind of a reminder that what would be required by ordination. Yep.
yes,
This is purely conjecture, but I am surmising that with very, very few exceptions, nobody in the Reformed Church in America spoke out against slavery. And I'm wondering if, in part, because you referenced A.J. Muste, your uncle, I'm wondering if in part, that's because of the Dutch psychology. We don't want to trouble the waters. I'm just curious what your opinion would be about that.
go along to get along. Well, also, there's also the consideration that if you just make a statement and there's nothing to back it up, then what are people going to say about you now? Well, you just mouth nice ideas, but you don't actually act on it. So it doesn't make any sense to make a brave statement about some social justice discipline and not be ready to back it up. If you're going to fly a rainbow flag and then somebody comes to your church and you're not nice to them, you're going to be in worse shape than you were before. And so it's dangerous. And that brings up something else that happened, having to do this time with the legacy of slavery, which is the racism that we still struggle with in our culture today. Number one, the Reformed Church has accepted as creedal, in other words, obligated, it's right up there with the Apostles' Creed and so forth, the Velder Confession, which came out of South Africa in about, it was created back in the 80s, maybe? Okay. And then by 2011, I think it was, or maybe a little bit earlier, the Reformed Church in America got to the point where the synod was willing to make the very complicated and requires a lot of consensus to go with that confession. So if you put in Velder Confession and read it, it's not that long, but it is a very serious, humbling statement of the crime of slavery and racism that we carry and then seeking away. Yeah.
Interestingly enough, part of the resistance to the Velder came from those who felt that if we accepted the Velder as a confessional statement along with the canons of Dort, Heidelberg, and Belgic Confession, that would be opening the door to be more open and affirming of
Of
same
LGBT.
sex, of the LGBTQI community.
Oh, because
So
we all
I
know
heard
how
that at General
one
Synod
thing
frequently.
leads to another. This is a slippery slope. Can't open that door. Yeah, I'm sure there was some of that because it is aligned with that. So we face racism today in our schools. I showed you a dramatic example in that thing about the whitewashed slavery picture that you get from that Christmas book. And there are other books that distort the lies they're telling about. I don't know if I explained that my dissertation on Frederick Douglass was actually taking a look at all of the books that had been written for children since his death in 1895 to 1995. Write it for children and call it nonfiction. You're writing a biography for children. You're not claiming that it's fictionalized. And how did they portray Frederick Douglass? And it's very interesting to go through the different decades, when the decade of 1895 to maybe 1920. And then the wife of W.E.B. Du Bois wrote one of those books. It's fictionalized, but it was still presented as Douglas's life. And she makes some interesting twists. And then other books in the 60s and in the 90s when I was writing, there were about 10 different picture books for children on Frederick Douglass, some very simple indeed. But what they chose to show and not to show, since Douglass gave such a complete picture of his own child, and guys, we have no other observers. That is the primary source. And so the ways that it was twisted and left out and rewritten is a story of our culture's willingness to reshape the image of Frederick Douglass as it's coming down as one of our precious lives, and how it's been sometimes faithfully portrayed, but very often not, and not all that great in the 90s, because this is a brand new book. You keep seeing the same thing. And now a last story about a church in Holland that tried to, in 2022, put out in front of the church a Black Lives Matter sign. And I don't mind telling you because it is common knowledge, and the minister told me this. This decision was reached by the correct elders in the correct way, and they had a consensus, realizing and discussing what it might cost to put out in 2022 a Black Lives Matter sign. And they decided to put it up only after the election so that it would not seem like an election, influencer. And so that issue was covered. And they put out the sign. Backlash, big time. About 7 or 8 families come to the minister, and he told me this, and say, hey, take that sign down or we're out of here. That's a political statement and we don't like it and we don't agree with it. It says all the wrong things. It's da-da-da-da-da. And we gave the church $100,000 last year. So you better listen to us because we're out of here if you don't take the sign down. Very direct like that. Not being nice. I mean, this is not nice opposition. This is teeth. It's got teeth. So the consistory tries to decide what to do, and they brought in a mediator from Indiana, an outsider who can get the two sides together and try to have them talk. And that was an honest and true effort to try to negotiate this. And they negotiated wording that was not Black Lives Matter. And it was wording that I didn't think improved the situation. I think the wording they came up with, it was in ways worse than Black Lives Matter. So a church cannot safely post even a sign like that with the public acceptance that it needs in order to do that. They bravely stuck with the sign. They would not take it down, but they did reword it to say, it has 2 sides now. If you drive past Third Church, you'll see this. On one side, it says, Black lives are beloved by God, and then in smaller words below it, and by us. Black lives are beloved by God and by us. And then on the other side of that sign, it's a beautiful sign, and it's intended to be permanent now. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God, with your God. I don't know why they put your in there. Micah 6:8, the Bible verse. Comments on that resolution?
Did the people that threatened to leave then come back or stay?
I am not sure of the answer to that. Kim is going to tell you. Kit's going to tell you.
We lost a lot more people than 7 families. People left one by one, singles, families, and so on. In fact, we had one, I will not call him a gentleman, an individual former member who worked the downtown area, indicating that he would go to speak to different people who come up to him and listen, saying, do not support Third Reformed Church because they have hung this sign on the side of the church. Now, I will say that the sign was hung first right over one of our gorgeous
One of the most precious stained glass windows.
windows. But anyway, and then that was moved. But I think this time at Third Church is maybe finally over, but not really. Not really.
Finally over, but not really. Don't we always have to say that? Well, I think we have to give the Third Reformed Church elders a bravery award for having tried to meet the face of what we're facing and not be just silent like a bump on a pickle and hope that this blows over. But the attack, going back now to the time of abolitionism, Frederick Douglass. So I'm going to take another 3 minutes, but if people have to go, that's okay. I'm going to explain that Frederick Douglass had a major campaign against the Northern Reformed Church, not Reformed, Northern Protestant churches in general. Of course, they were basically Protestant. There were very few Catholic churches in the North at this time. At the end of his 1845 narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, he appended an attack on the church. And it was direct, and he had had his heart crushed because he expected to find the northern churches supporting the desire for freedom and the plight of the slaves. And that's not what he saw. And so he has this attack. Harriet Beecher Stowe immediately wrote to him, and you have to appreciate that she was not only the husband of a professor of theology, but she was the sister of 6 ministers. People said that the Beecher family single-handedly was trying to meet the need for more pastors. So she knew what ministers face and how they feel. And she wrote to Frederick Douglass and said, please, please, please don't attack the church. I know that they're slow. I know that they're confused, but they're your best hope. She said, they're your best hope, so don't alienate them. So he sort of listened, but in his second autobiography, he did it again. He came back, and under the guise of an apology, he kind of punched him again and didn't apologize. So it's interesting to look at that. And then if you look at his 4th of July speech, what to the slave is the 4th of July? If you read the whole thing, you'll be doing something that nobody is doing. People are chopping off the whole last section of the speech where, you know, he's speaking to abolitionists. So saying that slavery is bad is like praising mother, home, and apple pie. He's got no resistance to that. But when he gets to the part where he is prophetically calling sort of a Jeremiah to the Northern Church, that they have to do more and they have to do it better, and attacking this, no matter who you see give that speech, no matter what great Black actor delivers this wonderful speech, the only thing the kids in school are going to hear is the first part about the mother, home, and apple pie, slavery's bad. But the part where he attacks the church, they chop it right off. So you should go in there and see what Frederick Douglass is saying. And he names names, and he believes in the protest technique of naming names. If you name names and get specific, you'll have better results, is the advice. And so, and then later on, after the banner, see, he lived till 1895. So during the entire Reconstruction, he's still raising his voice. So he had very nasty things to say about the banner after the banner was formed, because he found something in there that just broke his heart. It was just not at all what he wanted to see. So Douglass is one of the people accusing the church. And here, this Black scholar is very down on the Dutch Reformed Church, but she does bring the Dutch Reformed Church into this story where it belongs, instead of the Quaker and Methodist alliances that she says were mistakes. So here's Nell Irwin Painter at Princeton Seminary or Princeton University writing this. And not so far away is this Kirkpatrick Chapel on New Brunswick's campus, where, as I said on the first day, all these portraits have been taken down, and down comes Hardenbergh, and down comes Frelinghuysen. Not fair, because Frelinghuysen helped sponsor the Great Awakening, and there was a serious anti-slavery stream in that same Great Awakening turn in the evangelical history. And so, you know, they're down, and maybe rightly so. But if you look at the Hardenbergh sketch in here, it is not flattering at all. It's just brutal, and maybe rightly so. So there's an issue here. Now for next week, I will send you some readings that relate to all this. And again, we'll look at the readings together and take it up from your questions. There's so much to cover here that it's hard to know how to attack it. Are there any questions or suggestions for next week of questions you'd like answered, or things you'd like to go back to moving forward? We're not going to get up into the recent past. I think we're going to just go as far as we can, because I think your interest is in the earlier period. We kind of know more about where the American churches were after, let's say, 1900. Okay,
Thank you, Linda.
thank you.